So yes, as we are already talking in English, I will go on with that as we now come to our keynote. And it's quite important that our keynote speaker knows that I'm talking about him. Éireann Leverett is a senior scientist in the Airbus Cyber Innovations team and senior risk researcher at the University of Cambridge. He is the keynote speaker of this year's IT-SECX, and the topic of his keynote is actually the topic of this year's event. Security risk economics, the value of security or missing security. And so he's introducing us to what this evening is all about. The connection between economics and security. Please, ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Éireann Leverett.
I'm supposed to use one of these. Is this working? No? Testing? There we go. Okay. So that's me, and that story was true. And Thomas did indeed sit with a bunch of hackers, dirty hackers. You know, many years ago, I was one of those people. And he was very patient with us and listened to us. And I do think, at the time, Siemens was getting hammered with a lot of vulnerability reports because of Stuxnet. And it was a bit unfair. Like, there were a lot of other companies that deserved to have their products checked as well, but they didn't know the brand names of those products. But his point is absolutely correct. Like, at the time that I met him, I was already working on the offensive kind of red team side, but previously I'd been at GE in quality assurance. And when I was there, one of the things I realized is often inside the security team, I had more in common with someone in a security team and another company than I did with my fellow employees, because I'd have to argue with them for budget for security, whereas someone at another company had the same problems I did. So anyways, thanks for that warm welcome. And it is kind of amazing looking back on that conference 10 years later, but here we are. Okay, I'll try not to bore you if I can make the slides work. But to begin with, this is a slogan of another conference that I admire. And I think it's very important that data is better than dogma. We have a lot of opinions in security. We give a lot of advice. We don't always check our advice, right? I'm formerly an engineer. I guess I'm still an engineer, technically, but I've slid over into risk. So I've stopped thinking about things as a kind of if this, then that kind of scenario, and I do more probabilistic work. And I like to back up the solutions that we make for security with some data, if I possibly can. Another thing that was said to me by someone far wiser than I, Dan Gear, recently in an email was a question. And I'll start this presentation with that same question, which is, do we lack data or do we lack discipline? I think, many years ago, we didn't have data for a lot of the security problems that we were interested in. But now, as we go forward in time, we're starting to find more and more and more data. And the question is, can we use it wisely? And one way to use it is to look at it through the lens of engineering. How do I build better firewalls or widgets or intrusion detection systems or whatever? And another is to look at it through an economic lens, and then, of course, a risk lens or socioeconomic status lens. So my point is that take the same data and look at it through different lenses, and you can learn different things. All right, let's get on with it, because I know you've seen a lot of boring security presentations over the years, especially keynotes. Keynotes can be terrible. A friend of mine says, keynotes are where old hackers go to die, right? My son laughs at that joke too. Okay, if we're security professionals, we should be reducing one of these two things, maybe both. Ideally both, not always both. But you should be reducing the frequency or the severity of some security event, whatever that might be. A DDoS attack, ransomware, whatever. And I'm going to jump across different types of harm, cyber harms. I'm sorry I said cyber, but we're in that era that they say that normally. I'm going to go through different types of harms as we talk about risk, but we're going to focus on risk. So either be reducing frequency or severity. That's the idea. Now, one of the things that often gets the topic of risk going is talking about who gets hacked, right? And I'm going to talk about ransomware, because I don't think any of you have drunk enough today, but by the end of the day, you're going to want to, because ransomware. So who gets hacked? First of all, before we even start, does anyone know how old ransomware is? Anybody want to tell me? Is it new? No, right? 30 years old, roughly. It's probably even older, but we know it's at least 30 years old. It's old enough to live in my basement and not pay rent, basically. Who gets hacked in ransomware cases? Everyone. Or as I like to say, everyone. And that's important because I do a lot of risk for cyber insurance companies. And we talk about whether or not size or sector of company has an impact. How much they spend on security budgets, does it have an impact? How many employees they have, does it have an impact? All of these things get discussed. But do we do the science? Do we go out and check? I read a report yesterday that I found absolutely fascinating. It showed that the correlation between the size of the company and the amount of loss they have is 0.22. It's not very much. So bigger companies can have big losses, but small companies can have losses larger than their revenues. There's not a lot of correlation to size, and that leaves the open question, what does it correlate to? It's really interesting to me. Okay, so here's all the different sectors that get hit. Is this because of targeting, or is this because it reflects the population in wider society? It's an interesting question. How do we know how much to spend? This is another question I get asked all the time. I can't say I know in all cases, but I often spend a year or two trying to figure it out. And I've spent quite a bit of time with ransomware, as you'll understand in a moment. Let's start with an individual Bitcoin address. Not very exciting, right? What does it show? Not a whole lot about ransomware. Let's say it's taken from a particular piece of ransomware, and you look at how much money was made by that address. That's commonly what people do. It's a little bit sad. I wish we could do a lot more. I live just outside of Cambridge. It's a small town. There's not much to do in the evenings, so we gather ransomware data, right? We look at Bitcoin addresses. Now think about that address, and you think about how much money went into that account in Bitcoin, and then you have to figure out what it is in US dollars or euros or whatever currency you're interested in, so you got to watch the Bitcoin price at the same time. That's fine, that stuff's easy. But a lot of people don't think about the fact that each one of those payments is an infection. And it's probably within 2 weeks of the infection. Maybe they were dwelling inside the network for 6 months or something, and they only launched the ransomware later. But each one of those is an infection, and that's a lower bar, right? Because lots of people don't pay ransoms, or we hope lots of people don't pay ransoms. So let's talk about how many people do. So we can use this to both talk about the volume of ransomware and the frequency. And I'm going back in time here, sort of 10 years, as you'll see in a moment. I wish it was 10 days. It feels like 10 days. But it's 10 years. 10 years we've been looking at these problems. This is how much money was made by these individual gangs. That's not how much money the companies lost. That's how much money the gangs made. And it's not even all the gangs that I know of in existence. I just put the biggest ones that I could put into a tree map graph. So I'm sorry that I don't speak German. I speak a bit of Turkish, a bit of Norwegian. But I do speak data science, and I try and use big visuals to make my point. We don't talk about these older gangs, CryptoLocker, Cerber. Not as much anymore. We focus on the newer ones like NetWalker or QLocker or some of the others. And there's always a new one that I've never heard of, and then I go and look at it and I go, wow, it's bigger than I thought, or it's more interesting infection mechanisms. But look at that, more than 1 billion, right? Just from one gang alone. I find that disturbing. All right, this is what ransomware looks like if you look at it over a decade of time, right? We've had a decade of ransomware. Have we solved it? Doesn't look like it. Is that an engineering problem? Or maybe that's a risk management problem. Maybe that's a public health problem, not unlike a pandemic. And we should talk about it differently. We should store some of that data and think about it. The astute amongst you will notice that it goes down to 10 to the minus 1. A lot of that is financial forensics transactions, microtransactions, tracing the payments. Some people think it's test transactions. If you look at the data long enough, you can discern between those two different things, because you can see if a single small payment went through and then a large payment, or if it was just lots of small payments from the same address across multiple families. It becomes interesting on this scale. But the largest payments are in there. And people will keep telling you that ransomware is getting bigger and badder, and they're asking for more money, and it's happening more frequently. I don't actually think all of that's true, but you need to look at a decade of data before you really understand whether those things are true. Anyways, the point I want to make is it's not an emergency. And with this same data, this is from 26,000 Bitcoin addresses that I've collected from analyzing malware for a long time. Lots and lots of malware, scraping addresses out. And a lot of people focus on how the encryption mechanisms work or how the lateral movement works, but I want to focus on the economics because it helps me talk about the risk stuff. Okay. So, log scale as well. The other thing I want you to notice is 2014, there were some peak ransoms. 2018, there were some peak ransoms. But those peaks aren't particularly bigger than each other, right? All right, so let's break it down by family instead. I hope you don't mind if I drink during the rest of this presentation. I hope the rest of you will want to drink afterwards. But these are the different families, and this is how much money they've made. So you can see there is some variation between the amount of money that different gangs make, but for the most part, those peak and trough ransoms are roughly the same. So, are some gangs really more impactful? Yes, they definitely collect more ransoms. And that means they have more victims, and we can look at this as victimology instead of just as the amount of money, as I was saying earlier. So how do some of these gangs determine their initial price? One of the things I promised you that I would talk about is risk, right? And not simple, threat times vulnerability kind of risk, but more serious approach to risk. And one of the things that I wanted to think about was how these gangs make an estimate of how much damage their ransomware is going to do inside a company. Because that's their leverage, right? That's how they're going to get the ransom paid in the first place. They have to take a probabilistic view of this because not everyone's going to pay a ransom. And they want to get these big payouts. So they need to have some leverage. They need to do some damage in some way, shape, or form. And of course, we can talk about double extortion and the different methodologies and so on and so forth. But how do they do their initial negotiation? And this is one of the themes I want you to take home. If you want to do risk research and you're trying to figure out how these things work, look at what the attackers are doing. Think about the economics from the point of view of the attacker. Try and quantify it as much as possible. It may not be exactly the same as it is for the defender, but it's a good start. And it's in some ways easier. That's one of the things that's beautiful about ransomware is the blockchain became a scoreboard for how badly we're doing at security. I'm going to let that sink in. All right. So they begin. You can look up this particular point. It's in the footnotes of the presentation later. There was an interview with one particular ransomware gang where they talked about how they would begin with 5% of the annual returning revenue of a company as their beginning point for negotiation. I think that's pretty interesting. And that gives me some perspective on risk, right? How much money do they think that they can extract from these companies? So we're slowly sort of getting at the value of our security failures here, right? That's what we're playing around with. Looking at this over a decade. If we go back to those previous graphs, this one in particular, this is how much we're willing to pay in society to not fix it yet. And I think that's disturbing, but that's why we're here. One of the other things that's difficult in risk is working out the risk inside one company at a time, figuring out what's going on with just the incidents you have available. And the reason for that is, let's say we've got failed login attempts. You might have lots of data on failed login attempts. You have lots of high-frequency data as a security professional. What you don't necessarily have is the infrequent stuff, like an APT attack or a ransomware event, until you've been in the industry a little bit longer and you've seen those things. For that, you should go outside of your company. So what I want you to think about is, what are the kinds of incidents that we see, security incidents, inside a company that we see all the time, and we can study those from a risk perspective? And what are the kinds of things that we have to study with outside companies? We have to look across 20,000 companies or 50,000 companies or 3 million companies to get a perspective on. And that's where ransomware became kind of interesting to me. All right, I work in insurance. I know, it's boring. It's super boring. It's really fun having been a former penetration tester. As you heard from Thomas, I used to go around doing penetration tests on industrial systems around the globe, and I loved it. And people thought that was amazing. And at parties, they would go, "What do you do?" And I would tell them, and they would ask me about it for hours and buy me drinks, and it was interesting for a little while. Later, I got tired of that. I'm really bored of myself. I don't want to talk about my research. I want to talk about your research, right? So I'd go to parties and people would go, "What do you do?" And I go, "Insurance." And they would talk for hours because they didn't want to talk about insurance. And it means that I got to learn a bunch of new cool stuff. But there is some fun in insurance. And one of the things that's fun is you get to look at thousands and thousands of claims or hundreds of claims, millions of claims, depending on what kind of things you're looking at. So I've had the chance to work with ransomware claims in a variety of different ways. I'm not a fan of paying ransoms, which we all know the insurance industry has been doing. We can talk about that offline, maybe over a beer later. But one of the things I can tell you is that 10 to 40% of the ransomware claims I see in insurance is the ransom. So now we can move from how much money the ransoms were and how much the bad guys made in time. with a little bit of math to figuring out what the losses are, at least at a societal level. Maybe not for each individual company, but we can get a sense of what that is, right? So we just do a little bit of mathematics, really simple, moving the equation around, and we get to 10 to 50% of your annual returning revenue could be the cost of a ransomware event. Now the question is, how likely am I to be hit? What's the frequency? We still don't know that yet, unless you look at thousands and thousands of claims, right? Then you start to get a perspective. So all of you will be familiar with the Gordon-Loeb model, of course. We should be spending 37% of the catastrophe we want to prevent. And here we've got an idea of what that catastrophe is. And this is just ransomware. This isn't even including data breach or DDoS or other issues. So one of the interesting things as a risk professional is, if I spend money on this to protect me from ransomware, let's say backups, does it also protect me from earthquakes or floods in data centers or other things? So can I use my risk mitigation spending in more than one place, more efficiently? Can I do more with less money? That's one of my favorite questions. So let's get to that question. How frequently are people hit by ransomware? Like I said, small town, very boring. I read a lot of academic papers. I'm friends with people who write academic papers. I write a few of my own. I decided you could take each of those ransoms and look at them in a different way, which is how often are people getting hit, right? It's just the unit of the ransom. And this is the same gangs that I showed you earlier by number of victims. And when I say victims, I don't mean everyone who was infected by this ransomware. I mean only the people who paid a ransom. So the number of victims is higher than the graph that you're looking at here. And you can see that, you know, these two gangs alone account for more than 1 million victims over a decade, right? That's an interesting question. Why are we failing to solve this at a societal level, right? And it helps me get to some estimates. It helps me work out the frequency. Okay, so here's the 95% confidence interval for how many ransoms are paid per day by day of the week. It's really simple to build graphs like this, right? You take 10 years of data. Yeah, we have 10 years of data in the blockchain. And you snip it up by week, and then you overlay it. And the variance in how many ransoms were paid on any given day is right there. Can you believe that people pay 600 to 900 ransoms a day, and the average is the nice little white line down the middle, right? And you can see more people pay on a Monday. That's an interesting fact, because the people who pay are the victims, and they control the timeline of when they pay. It's not necessarily under the control of the attacker when the Bitcoin payment is made. Okay? So, do we lack data, or do we lack discipline? 2 to 3% of companies are hit annually. Again, you can go and look at this paper. It was done by someone I studied with at Cambridge, and he did a survey. You can come at these numbers from different perspectives. You can get them in different ways, but 2 to 3% of companies are hit by ransomware, at least in 2016. We should be specific about these things, right? And his sample size was something like 4,000, I think. You can also come at this from the graph that I just showed you a moment ago. So now we have frequency, and now we have severity. Now we have it for all companies, or all US companies, or all European companies, or whatever. But at least it's a rough number. Start with a bad number and refine it, and refine it, and refine it. And that's how we get places with risk. That says, using the Gordon-Loeb model, that you should be spending 1.5% of your annual returning revenue on ransomware alone. And I know we're not doing that. But that's what we recommend to people to do. And that's one of the things that we use to decide whether a company is insurable or not. And as companies become uninsurable, we have some movement of some of our other problems in security, shall we say. All right. So I think this is a good budget. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't care about budgets. Maybe you just want to get back to the hacking of things. Then this question is for you instead of all that economics. How do we know if we're doing the right things? I think measuring the effectiveness of risk treatments or engineering treatments is very, very important. And I'd like to see how people do that. So I'm going to make a switch of topics here. I hope you don't mind. It's the luxury of being a keynote speaker, is you get to change the topic all the time just to confuse people. So we're no longer talking about ransomware. We're talking about CVEs, right? And everybody loves CVEs. I used to love CVEs. I have a couple. Yeah, definitely not in any Siemens equipment. Yes, I do. And he was very good about it. In fact, one of my favorite things about working with various people over the years is how wonderful they were when you took them vulnerabilities. But going back to this topic. Only 4% of vulnerabilities have public exploits, says this paper at this one point in time. Maybe it's different. We'll talk about that in a little while. But of those with public exploits, 80% have the exploit published 23 days before the CVE. So what I'm about to talk to you about very briefly, this is like a teaser for later. I did this research with a wonderful researcher called Matilda Rode. She can't be here today. I'm really disappointed about that. But we'll still present the work, and she'll still stream in to give the talk with me. But this is a little teaser for that talk. And one of the things I thought about from my time as a penetration tester was I keep using the same vulnerabilities to compromise these different companies, and I'm on rotation. I'm just on heavy rotation. I'm going from one company to another using pretty much the same vulnerabilities and exploits, you know, writing the pen test report and moving on. And I come back 2 or 3 years later and they haven't necessarily even fixed the same thing. And that got me thinking more mathematically, you know? Pen testers aren't amazing. This isn't amazing stuff. We shouldn't all go around being arrogant about this. The problem is we don't necessarily fix the things we know how to fix. So what can we learn from this? And that's where I want you to take this graph away, right? This is a little bit old at this point, but the principle of the mathematics still applies. Some vulnerabilities just don't get exploited that often, even if they have an exploit. And some of them get exploited a lot, right? Like this one, right? It just keeps being useful for a long time. Some vulnerabilities are just awesome, and any red teamer, any penetration tester knows this. You'll find them in multiple organizations as you go around, and you'll be able to use them over and over and over. They're like your bread and butter vulnerabilities. So it got me thinking, if there's heavy tails of vulnerabilities, and there's another great paper by Luca Lodi about the heavy tails of exploitation, right? Some vulnerabilities are really, really heavily exploited, others not at all. So it got me thinking, if we need to patch these things, and we know that some vulnerabilities are more important than others, can we start to separate them into groups to help us figure out what should be patched first? And more importantly, can we predict in advance the number of vulnerabilities that there will be? And again, we're going to talk to you about that later, not necessarily in this presentation. This isn't my work. I was part of the working group that talked about it. I sometimes chat with these guys. But I really want you to know about it. They took a bunch of vulnerabilities for the last 3 or 4 years, well, 2017 till today. And they started scoring them based on their features with how likely they were to be exploited in the future. And they look back in time and they vet their own work to see how well they're doing and try and improve this. And I think that they're doing a fantastic job. And if you don't, that's okay. But come along to the working group and see how they do the science behind this. See how they guess in advance which vulnerabilities will get exploits. And again, if you're one of the red teamers in the room, you can already think about this, right? You already have an intuitive sense. Your expertise tells you that you would rather have remote code exploitation than directory traversal, right? Cross-site scripting is going to get exploited all the time because it's everywhere, and authentication bypass are a little bit rare. But I really would want one, and that would probably get an exploit written, whereas this other thing probably wouldn't. That's essentially what they're doing, but they're turning it into data science. They're making a science of it, right? Obviously, Windows has exploits written for it more. Firefox as well. You can look at different products. Adobe gets exploited more than other things. So they're scoring all CVEs in this way. And I think this helps you prioritize what you're going to patch in the future. So Matilda and I asked, could you forecast vulnerabilities? Not in their specific nature. Obviously, to forecast Heartbleed would be almost impossible, right? Maybe an expert could do it with some cleverness, but in a kind of machine learning way, it might be really difficult. But to say that there would be a vulnerability that was memory corruption in an important cryptographic library might be possible, especially if you expand to the time frame and you say within a certain year, so on and so forth. So how do we know how effective some of our risk treatments are? Like I said, I'm changing subjects all the time, so I apologize for that. But one of the answers is, if you think you don't have enough data, use counterfactuals, right? Let's take WannaCry. So the domain for WannaCry was registered fast enough to cause the attack to be reduced over time. So we could do a little bit of analysis. Like I could look, as I was telling you before, about at those Bitcoin addresses, the number of transactions they had in that time frame. And I could extrapolate how many more transactions they would have had if that domain was not registered, right? That's a counterfactual. I could also say, what if the domain was registered a day earlier or 2 days earlier? And that's a downward counterfactual as opposed to an upward counterfactual. And boom, now I have a single data point of WannaCry and 2 or 3 bits that we're flipping, and I'm expanding it into a larger and larger data set. And that's essentially what we did with this particular paper where we theorized an attack on the UK electricity distribution network and worked out the impact, the cost to society. And that was accepted by Lloyd's Market as part of a realistic disaster scenario. So, counterfactuals. Use your counterfactuals to say, if we stopped at this attack on this day, it would have saved us this much money. And if we'd stopped it 3 weeks later, we would have lost this much money. It'll help you understand the value of the security that you implement today. Okay? Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes you don't even have a scale of a harm, right? I know, insurance is boring. But one of the things that's interesting about insurance people is that they measure things. And it does matter, right? They have a scale of earthquakes. They have a scale, Saffir-Simpson, of wind speed. They can say a wind speed of this level equates this much property damage. And this much property value exists in Miami or in Vienna or wherever. And they can do estimates. They can model. They can predict. It's got a scientific approach to it. What's the scale of DDoS? What's the scale of ransomware? Can I compare a DDoS attack from 1998 to a DDoS attack that we have today? Why not? I can compare earthquakes from 2,000 years ago, 100 years ago, with the earthquakes that we have today. And bandwidth is growing. The number of people online is growing. The amount of money that we spend online is growing. We've got to account for that inflation inside of our DDoS statistics. So this was our attempt to do that. I know it's pretty weird. But Aaron Kaplan is a fantastic researcher who also lives here in Vienna. Well, not here, but in Vienna. And we worked on this paper together. We're also working on a new paper with a guy called Arturs, who's scanned the internet looking for reflectors. And this is getting back to my point about risk. If you invent a scale of a harm, it allows you to measure something. So we use this estimate where we multiply the amount of bandwidth that we detect in different places by the number of reflectors, and it gives us like what we think the available capacity of global DDoS bandwidth is at any given time. Why is that useful? Why would anyone possibly want to know that, except maybe the bad guys? And the answer is because then we can start to measure our mitigations. And that's what I see in this graph, right? If you want to look at this, you see down here, this is what Arturs measured as opposed to what our estimation of the amount was. Now, it looks like we're just really wrong. And you're right, we are. We're estimating things. But what I'm trying to get at is we thought this is what it could be, and this is what he found it was because people are doing filtering. People are doing transit filtering. So now I can measure the reduction and the improvement in security because I worked on a scale of the harm first. Does that make sense? If I put everyone to sleep, you want to go home. You want to just go drink. Okay, fair enough. What's a cool result about that? I know, I'm one of those boring guys that likes distributions and math. By the way, I wasn't always. I used to hate it. I slowly came to it. I slowly started to appreciate it. And one of the reasons I started to like it is because some mathematical distributions are bigger than others and they move faster and they have different shapes and it's starting to make sense to me. Those heavy tails are starting to make sense to me, right? In this graph, I'm going to show you something in a moment, and there's a super exciting result. Essentially, we normalized that capacity I was just talking about here into a percentage, okay? So this was our measurement of SSDP, okay? So we say, here's the potential that comes from these ASNs, and the ASNs are colored, and I know it's a really horrible graph in terms of coloring, but don't worry about that. Just look that there's basically only 5 ASNs here, okay? And then Arturs measured it. He found, so this is our estimate, this is empirical, and this is another estimate by another group that we also collaborate and work with. So these are basically 3 different methods for estimating the same thing. But they all show something similar, which is only 5 ASNs account for nearly 50% of the DDoS pollution. So as a regulator, if you were to intervene at only 5 ISPs and ask them to clean up their reflectors, you could have more than a 50% reduction of DDoS. I think that's exciting, right? Even though all that numbers stuff is a little bit boring. So, back to ransomware, because it's not depressing enough, right? A short crisis for you, but business as usual for the criminals. So if you want to estimate something about risk, don't just think about yourself. Don't just think about risk to yourself. The easiest way to start to think about risk is to think about your risk to others. And the pandemic gives me an awesome opportunity to talk about that. I could walk around all day wondering about what the risk is to me in a pandemic, or I could stop and think about how many shops do I visit. If I don't wear a mask, how many other people might I infect? And that gives you a new mindset. What is my risk to you as a vendor in your supply chain? And that gives me a way of thinking about how many times I interact with people, how many people download my software, what software do they use, how many vulnerabilities do my developers introduce, blah, 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 blah. This is something that Thomas and I have spoken about, and he understands very, very deeply. What is my risk to others if I don't do good security work? How am I posing a risk to other people? And by measuring it that way, it becomes easier to measure the risk to yourself as well. And I think that becomes very interesting. This graph really, really bothers me. It makes me so depressed. WannaCry ransoms were still being paid a month ago. They have very long tails in time. So look at this. This is weeks on the left-hand side. Weeks, right? Some of these ransomware campaigns, their payment infrastructure lasts years. The domains are gone. The infrastructure, the C2 infrastructure is gone. They're still receiving payments. Okay? That's a problem for us as society. It's like letting people go around infecting everybody else, the super spreaders, right? So what if we could get ahead of these problems? What if we could start to predict things? And this is, again, a little bit teaser on the vulnerability stuff that we'll present later. But one of the things I thought is, surely all these hackers, they go to Vegas, and they get drunk, or they don't get drunk, and they hang out in Vegas. Clearly, a lot of vulnerabilities are published in August. Maybe vulnerabilities are seasonal, right? Maybe it just happens because hackers want to publish at Black Hat. Well, that's a great opinion, but data is better than dogma, right? Have discipline. Don't just have data. And by the way, all the CVE data is publicly available. You can download it. You can look at it, same as we did, right? So I did one of these seasonality graphs of the number of vulnerabilities that are published in every given month over, what, 20 years of data for CVEs? And I basically, you can do this with the maths instead of the graph, but I put the graph up here to be nice to you. It's not seasonal. It's not seasonal. I don't know what's driving vulnerability publication rates, but it doesn't appear to happen more at certain times of year than at others, which is interesting, right? Okay, so here's the teaser that me and Matilda are going to show you some work that we did while I was at Airbus, where we can predict the number of vulnerabilities, CVEs, that will be publicly published, plus or minus 8% on average, 1 year in advance. We can also make some sub-predictions about how many might be Windows or how many might be above CVSS 7. Not all that work's done yet, but it'll get better over time. And to draw a metaphor from what we were talking about earlier, when the first weather forecasts were made, they were terrible. They weren't very good. But slowly, they scored themselves on their own prediction, and they got better, and they got better, and they got better, just like the EPSS folks did. I was inspired by those EPSS folks. I said, okay, you're telling me whether or not it'll have an exploit written. I'm going to try and get ahead of the problem and tell you whether or not there will be 20,000 vulnerabilities this year or 2,000, and how many of them will be emergency patch releases. And it sort of works, and we can talk about why and how. We used Little's Law, and we used an old serial number prediction trick, which was kind of fun. So you can see those in the middle. So there's a quick teaser, and we'll talk more about this later. This is what some of those predictions look like. And again, I'm going to break this down much, much later to go into greater detail. But that's one prediction. There you go, a year in advance. And you can see when this forecast was made. So if you're going to be serious about this, you got to be rigorous, and you say, this was made in August, so how are we doing? How many vulnerabilities have been produced in that time frame? And this is like looking back over time to see the predictions against, so the prediction is the dotted line, and the actual number of vulnerabilities is there. So that's a 1 year prediction. I think this one is a 6 month, this is a 3 month, and that is a 1 month. Yeah, it's not clear on this graph. There it is. Yeah, 1 month. So these predictions are fine, they're good, but you know, this one is the one we got really excited about, because you can start to do your patch planning a lot differently if you think about what's going to happen in the future. You can also, in an ICS network particularly, you can say, what are my maintenance windows? How will I, if I'm going to patch every 6 months on this particular product, how many things will I have to patch? You won't be right. It's plus or minus 2 or 15 or 20 or whatever. But if you can work with uncertainty bounds, it helps you, right? Okay. So if we did all of these different things and we thought about these things differently and we approached these things differently, and there's still this residual risk like there is with ransomware, then is this actually a public health problem? So Eric Jardine and I, Aaron Burns, Dan Gear, Ankit, we got together, we put all of our Bitcoin addresses, 26,000 of them, together We looked at the different families. We looked at the number of transactions. Those 26,000 addresses lead you to 2.4 million transactions. And then you start to measure what are the averages of ransoms. Because every report has an average ransom in it, right? And what we found is those averages are unstable because they fit a particular alpha of the power laws. I know, it's some boring math stuff. But basically, guess what else fits that? Wealth. Corporate wealth. So the patterns of corporate wealth are reflected here inside ransoms. So what I'm saying to you is that ransomware is essentially a tax on society. It's a willingness to pay, and we do pay. So how big is it? How big is it? How much is it affecting us? This is a minimum. So we take the average price of Bitcoin on the day that the ransom was paid, we get this number. So I'm telling you that over a decade, this is an $11 billion industry. And they might be losing a third of that in money laundering, but it's big. And they can spend that doing the kind of innovation R&D that I'm talking to you about here inside their own teams, inside their own gangs. Now, I told you just a moment ago, this is a minimum. If they waited until the Bitcoin all-time high, this is how much money they would have made. And giving you some perspective on this, this is like Berkshire Hathaway kind of stuff, right? This is big, big business. And if we're going to solve this problem, it's not just going to be because we published a hash really quickly of the malware and we blocked it. We're going to have to think a little bit differently. So differently, and again, I'm going to leave you with this hopefully sobering thought. It's what, 5 o'clock-ish, 4 or 5 o'clock? That's about here. So they've made another 40,000 US dollars while I've been speaking to you. We really need to tackle this problem differently on a global scale. This is a book me and some other people wrote. Thank you for listening. There's more details in here. You'll be able to download this and look at the references and see whether or not I made it all up. So challenge me, ask me questions, and thank you very much for listening. And we'll talk more about predicting CVEs with my co-pilot on that, Matilda, in a little bit. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time. So if there are any questions, now is the time for it.
The masked man in the back. Are there microphones for questions, or? It looks like it's coming to you. Cool. I like this bit. The suspense is terrible. I hope it'll last.
So thank you for the great talk. I personally wonder why insurance companies started to pay ransomware fees. I mean, because the incentive for the criminals are really high that they just use ransomware and tech companies because they get paid because the insurance pays the fees. Do you have some idea why they started to pay out the ransomware fees? I mean, it's like a never-ending pot of putting money into criminals.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you can imagine I get it a lot. I was advocating for insurance companies not to do this for a long time. But there's a lot of factors at play. One is kind of like climate change. It's easier to keep driving my car than it is to solve climate change for everyone on the planet. And this is kind of like that. In each individual case, you would look at how much money you're going to lose and whether or not you pay the ransom. And on a case-by-case basis, cost-benefit only, no experience of the security industry, you might go, well, maybe just this once. Slippery slope, right? Number two, second reason, kidnap and ransom insurance exists, and I think for good reason. And a lot of those people needed a new profession to go into, and ransomware showed up. So there's suddenly a whole bunch of professionals that used to do this other ransom negotiation that are now willing to do this kind of ransom negotiation. So that's another element that led us there. I also think that there are issues with just banning the payments entirely, because it goes underground and you don't necessarily have the statistics. So I'm not advocating payment to have statistics, but one of the benefits of the fact that people are paying them is that we have statistics. So with the insurance companies, it's still more complicated. Not every insurance company pays the ransoms. Plenty of them say, we won't pay the ransoms, but we only talk about the ones that do. And we don't necessarily keep track of how often they do and under which circumstances. I think that's someplace that we could innovate. Not to mention, if you make it illegal and none of the insurance companies cover it, then some company in some offshore place keeps doing it. So we have this challenge that we want to keep it under surveillance and we don't want them to pay. And that's where I say, like, let's go back to the metrics, right? What we really want to do is keep track of this stuff. Sorry to flash so many graphs at you, but this particular graph, if we took, forward one. If we took this graph and we kept measuring it over time and we wanted to see it decrease and decrease and decrease, and we viewed this stuff as a public health problem where we kept statistics at national and international levels, then we could do that. We could say, hopefully less people are paying ransoms and their less money is being paid, and let's reduce it over time. That would be fantastic. So I'm sorry that some people do bad stuff, including large corporations like insurance companies, but we're all grown-ups, and that's how this happens. Yeah, it's a shame. Help me argue with them. And one of the ways to argue with them is go, hey, financially over time, you're going to end up paying more money, even if on this particular case, it's a cost benefit, right? Because they're not going to respond to the moral argument. I've never sat down and read religious texts with other insurance companies. Just saying. Any other questions? Short question and a long poll. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Can you break it up into different parts if it's a really long one?
My opinion is that if you compare the virtual and the real world, the physical world, there's like different risk factors. In the real world, the risk is typically limited by physical distances and stuff like that. And in the virtual world, it's like harder to limit it because there's so many interconnections and everything. So how are like cyber insurance companies are able to cover risk in the virtual world like with the methods of the real world? For me, it doesn't really work, because you can't compare an earthquake with something like WannaCry or whatever, because it scales much better and faster.
Exactly.
So what are the models like in cyber insurance companies?
Do you want a job? I'm like joking, but I'm not, right? Like, we precisely need people like you asking those questions. So the mathematics of the old physical world, shall we say, doesn't particularly need to change. That's fine. Some of the mathematics is going to be the same. Not exactly the same. I'm not saying that, the way we do risk on health problems in national insurance is the same as it's going to be for cyber. But, the math is still there, and we're going to use the same tools, same toolbox, okay? Now, the virtual world, shall we say, and I don't even like that dichotomy, because I think what happened is, like, software ate the world, the internet ate the physical world, right? Like, there was always real harm in the virtual world. It's like, people get let out of jail because someone sends a fraudulent email. People get killed, dissidents get targeted based on their metadata. The idea that the virtual world was like virtual harm and the real world was real harm, it just doesn't exist, right? But getting back to your point, we have to study that stuff. The science isn't done, right? So how does contagion work on the internet? And you could say the contagion between these machines works like this, but then how does it work at the organizational level? Like, I understand TCP, IP, and sessions, and like how a virus can rip through a network. But now we also need to think about the network of companies, and the network of countries, and the network of people, and phones, and so on. And we start to need to normalize that data, and we need to gather those statistics and use them wisely. And so we need people asking those burning questions like you're asking there, and that's how I started. I was like looking at the work of other cyber insurance companies going, this is terrible, don't do this. And then I ended up like working on it and getting interested in the math. So beware, danger. But yes, please keep asking those questions. Do you have other specific ones? No? Okay. Yeah, virtual and physical, not so separate. And I think a lot of those are open research problems is my answer. So I feel like I'm sort of tackling ransomware with what I've shown you. There's still cloud. There's still DDoS. I'll give you an example. A DDoS attack happens, and it's 5 gigabytes per second. How much money is going to be lost by the company? That's the thing we need to do predictive risk, right? We need to understand that. And you might say it'd be different for different companies and depending on their bandwidth, but then we need a science behind that to measure those things and see what the correlation of all those factors is. So it's a wide open area for research for anyone who's interested. And don't let it give you the impression you can't also do reverse engineering and malware, because I still do a little bit of that. But the mathematics goes hand in hand, and it takes you further. So you can do both. You can be a hacker and do a little bit of math for insurance companies. Other questions? I'm going to enjoy my mata.
Yeah, I would like to know your opinion on this, because I was talking with a colleague about cyber insurance, and he was telling me that these companies, they usually want you to do a lot of basic security stuff or more advanced stuff, so that of course they don't have to cover, or that the chance that something is really happening to your company is really low. So in my point of view, they are really forcing you to really mitigate your risk so that it doesn't even happen, so that they don't have to pay. So in some way, maybe it's even good, although I'm not a fan, but at least they are putting a lot of rules so that you have to fulfill, so that you even get the insurance.
Yeah. So one of the theories of change, shall we say, from us old-timers in security with all the war wounds and the pain and trauma of the last decade that was wasted, is that we hoped that more companies would be incentivized financially to do the good things that help protect them. But we didn't see that the incentives were working very well, because everything was done on this kind of cost-benefit, case-by-case basis. And, you know, whole PhDs have been written about security economics on exactly those topics. So one of the theories of change with insurance was that it was going to drive change. I can tell you, as an industry insider, I thought the same thing. Then I started to look at the problem, and I realized that the premiums I'm taking from these companies are small enough that if you want them to implement an intrusion detection system, it's definitely more expensive than the reduction in premium I'm going to give them. So we're not going to drive change quite that way, if that makes sense. But one of the interesting stories here is you don't have to insure companies. You could insure people like we do with engineers. And you could say engineers who don't do X, Y, and Z don't get to be insured, right? You could also insure products instead of companies. So you could say, I'm going to insure this software because it was built using these principles. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that'll happen anytime soon, but you could, in theory. And I think that would lead to the kind of change that you're talking about and you're hoping for. So, you know, an important thing for security professionals to think about is what's your theory of change? And then sit down and figure out if it is going to drive that change or not, right? So I'm in cyber insurance because I like the problems more than because I think it's necessarily going to change everything with security. But it also gives me a chance to figure out what does actually change people's security posture. You know, does spending more money on firewalls or incident response teams make a difference? And what are the ratios of that matter? So, but brilliant question. And yes, more of this. Did that answer your question? Or am I just rambling? Okay, all right.
But maybe, right, next, there is more time for you to talk about all these questions, because thank you very much, Éireann Leverett. And as we see, when it